So the first question that every photographer starts off asking is, what should my first camera be? Now this is something that I think every photographer can relate to, and it can kind of be a little bit of a confusing world when you're getting into photography, learning lenses, cameras, all this different stuff. So I'm going to kind of simplify it in this video to help you figure out what your first camera should be and maybe what some of the things you should be looking for when you do end up buying your first camera. So I've had quite a few cameras over the, 10 years I've been doing photography. My very first camera was a Canon Rebel that was given to me by my grandfather, and that's really what started my love of photography. So it's kind of all snowballed from there. But there were points where I needed to start buying my own cameras, buying my own gear, and these are some of the things I wish I had had answered for me when I was going out and buying my first camera. So I think the thing that is on everybody's mind, the first thing you think about when you're buying a camera is how much is it going to cost and what should my price range be? Now, this might not be the popular opinion for a lot of photographers, but my opinion in buying your first camera is just buy the cheapest camera you can. Now, I'm not saying go out there and buy, a $40 camera, because there are a few things that you need to look for when you are buying a camera. And I'll kind of go over a few of the little things right now. So the type of camera that you're going to be looking for is a DSLR, which kind of looks like this. And DSLR stands for Digital Single Lens Reflex, and the key word there being digital. Now, the key about these type of cameras is, number one, obviously they're digital, so you can take as many pictures as you want, kind of get used to the functions and how it works. But also one of the key features of these is you can actually take the lenses off, buy new lenses, stick new lenses on, and each lens will kind of have a different effect that it'll give you, whether it's super zoomed in or maybe a shallow depth of field, which is where you have the blurriness behind your subject. So that's the kind of camera that we're going to be talking about in this episode. So like I was saying earlier, you really don't want to be spending a lot of money. I mean, you want to be trying to stay under, I would say, $500 for your first camera and lens. Now, the reason why is this is your first camera, and obviously you're going to be learning a lot about photography over the first year that you're doing this. And maybe when you get further into it, you decide maybe you don't like photography, so it's a lot easier to kind of drop $500 than maybe dropping like $2,000. So I think that's really one of the key things. But just by getting a $1,000 camera doesn't mean you'll not be able to take great photos, because this camera right here took some of the best photos I've ever taken. And I mean, you can pick one of these up for like $200 now. I'll show a picture up on the screen right now of a picture that I actually took with that camera right there, which is a Canon T4i. And I mean, it's one of my favorite cameras. It's the camera that I personally recommend to everybody. And it has really served me well over the last few years. Now, the second reason why you might be wanting to go with a cheaper camera is that maybe, you decide you want to go with a different brand. So maybe you start off with Nikon and you decide you want to go with Canon. Because you're getting a cheap lens and a cheap body, it's really not going to be, again, a huge issue to kind of dump the camera and the body, because especially if you're going for a used camera, it's actually gonna hold its value a little bit better than buying a new camera, because you're buying this camera right here, which is maybe 6-7 years old. You can buy it for $200. You can sell it for $200. So you aren't going to be dropping a lot of money and then also losing out in the long run if you want to switch to different brands. Now, another way you can save money on your first camera is just asking around if anybody actually has a spare camera. Like, I've got a few cameras, nobody's ever asked to borrow one or use it for a long period of time, but I'd be willing to loan out one of my cameras to somebody that's trying to get into photography or is at least showing an interest in it. And I don't have any super brand new cameras that I have to loan out, but it might answer somebody's question whether or not photography is something they want to take a little bit more seriously. So part number 2 is kind of deciding which brand you want to go with. Now, This goes second to price because I think price should honestly be the first factor in deciding which camera you want. But if you already have a preference to brand, whether it's Canon, Sony, Nikon, whatever, I think that will also be an important determining factor in your choice. So I personally started off with Canon, and I stayed with them for quite a while. I purchased a few bodies, purchased multiple lenses, but I would say that all of the camera manufacturers have their benefits and their drawbacks. Now with Canon and Nikon, I would say that they're pretty fairly matched. I mean, they both come out with cameras that are pretty comparable to each other. They come out with lenses that are very comparable to each other as well, and they're kind of considered the professional cameras in the photography world. A lot of the sports photographers or photojournalists use Canon and Nikon, but I wouldn't say that should necessarily be a determining factor in what you should be choosing. I think that if you want to go with a specific brand, I wouldn't look at really where you want to go in photography. I would say, do you know anybody? Does your mom, dad, a relative, somebody close to you, do they have Canon cameras, or do they have Nikon cameras or Sony cameras? Because if they do, that might give you an opportunity to borrow lenses or borrow pieces of the camera that you can try out on your camera. Because personally with me, I lucked out. I started off with Canon, and a lot of my friends and some of the people I worked with also had Canon cameras. So the lenses that they had, I could borrow, and they could also borrow my lenses. So I think that's also a key factor in deciding which brand you want to go along with. Now, another brand that I do want to kind of touch on is Sony, and I personally have moved from Canon over to Sony. And my reason being is that I feel like with Sony, they're offering cameras at a lower price point that Canon and Nikon haven't quite done yet. Like with this camera that I'm filming with right now, that's a Sony A6300. And I bought that for about $1,000 brand new when it very first came out. And it can shoot 4K video, it shoots 11 photos a second, which is incredible for a $1,000 camera. And I think it's something that Canon and Nikon haven't quite done yet. Not to say that the camera doesn't have its drawbacks, because it certainly does have its drawbacks. And I've also got another Sony camera right here. It's a Sony A7R. And while it's a fantastic camera, it does things at a lower price point than I think Canon and Nikon can compete with. But again, it does have its drawbacks. So one of the problems with Sony versus Nikon and Canon is that they actually don't have a huge lens selection in comparison. Like this camera right here, it's kind of a newer camera that they have. And it doesn't have the huge lens selection that Canon and Nikon do. Especially, they don't really have a lot of Sony lenses for their Sony cameras. Now, third-party manufacturers are starting to make quite a few lenses, but it's still kind of few and far between in comparison to Nikon and Canon. So if you're looking for a very specific lens, or even if you're just looking for better lens deals in general, because there's not a lot of selection for Sony cameras, the lenses are going to tend to be on the more expensive side in comparison. So I have picked 3 cameras from kind of the 3 major manufacturers, Nikon, Canon, and Sony, to kind of give you an idea of the kind of camera that you're going to be looking for your first camera. And I've got them right here. So these are all older cameras, and by older I mean they're years old. Some of them are much older than others. And the first one I'm going to start off with is Canon. Now, I'll show this on the screen right here. So here is a Canon T4i or T3i. T3i is older than the T4i, and this is actually what I have right here. This is the Canon T3i. Now, the great thing about these cameras is because they're old, you can get them for very cheap. Now, a lot of websites don't carry these cameras anymore because they've been discontinued for such a long time, but you can find these on Craigslist for super cheap. I mean, $200 for the camera and the lens. You just got to make sure it's working properly. Now with this camera, it's 18 megapixels. So 18 megapixels means that there are 18 million pixels, which is more than enough, especially for your starter camera. So it has 5,184 pixels going width wise and 3,456 going height wise. So just to kind of put that into perspective, like one of these cameras is more than enough if you're posting on like Instagram or something like that. I mean, this is too much camera for Instagram. So, if you're thinking that, 18 megapixels isn't very much anymore, it's still more than 99% of the population will ever need. So don't get caught up in all the megapixel talk, because honestly, 18 is more than anybody honestly really needs. So another benefit of this camera is it can shoot 1080p HD video, which is, doesn't seem as impressive now, but 1080p in a small camera like this is fantastic. Now, you may or may not have ever seen the footage that can come out of a DSLR, but I can promise you it's incredibly, incredibly impressive. And I'll probably show you some footage right here from maybe something I shot with this T4i, maybe something from a music video. Like I said earlier, the great thing about Canons is they have a ton of third-party lens support. So companies like Sigma and Tamron, they make a huge selection of lenses on top of the already huge lens selection that Canon has with its own lenses. And then I also want to talk about the Nikon side. Now, the camera that I picked for Nikon is Nikon D5200, and it's sort of comparable to the Canon. It does have a higher resolution sensor, so it's 24 megapixels compared to the 18 that Canon has. And so the pixels are 6,000 across and 4,000 high. And like I said before, because this is your first camera, I mean, you really aren't going to be making massive prints with it, which is really the only purpose of having a huge resolution on your camera. So once again, don't get, jaded by all these massive megapixel numbers, because honestly, like 18 from a Canon is more than you would need. Now, another benefit that the Nikon has over the Canon is that it can shoot HD video just like the Canon, but it also has the capability to shoot slow motion video at HD quality. So if you're also getting these cameras to shoot video, that would be a huge bonus for you to be able to shoot slow motion versus just regular motion. And like I said with Canon, with lens support, Nikon also has a huge selection of lens support, third-party accessories, third-party lenses, all that stuff. So you'll never have a shortage of lens selection for your Nikon camera. And then finally, I want to go over Sony. Now, the Sony camera that I kind of picked out is the Sony A5100, and it's kind of like their entry-level DSLR camera. It is also 24 megapixel, just like the Nikon, 6,000 pixels across, 4,000 pixels high. It can also shoot HD video, and it also has the capability for slow motion as well. So like I was saying before about the Sony cameras, is that because they don't have a huge lens selection, that might be a drawback for you. However, there is a benefit to this in that because all of the lenses that are coming out for these Sony cameras are new, they're gonna tend to perform better across the board in terms of sharpness and even just capabilities in other regions as well, as far as like stabilization, better autofocus performance, and things like that. So the last thing that I do want to talk about is lenses. So like I said before, Sony does not have a huge lens selection, so the lenses that you do find are going to tend to be a little bit more expensive, which is a little bit evident, as I'll kind of show you in a little bit. But one thing I do want to talk about is the kit lenses. Now, kit lenses are the lenses that typically come standard on your cameras. So like this right here is a kit lens. It's got a little bit of zoom to it, it's got stabilization in it, and it's a fantastic lens. Anybody that says that kit lenses are crappy or bad or they won't be good for you, don't listen to them, because for a starter, these lenses are, once again, more than you would ever need in a lens. With that being said though, there are lenses you can get for very cheap that will, I think, kind of spark your love of photography and also kind of get you the pictures that you have imagined in your mind when you're thinking about photography. Now, the lenses I'm talking about every single lens manufacturer makes these lenses because they are kind of the essential lens for everybody to have. It's a lens that I've had. It's a lens that almost any photographer should have in their bag if they don't already. Now this lens that I'm talking about is a 50mm lens. Now I've got a lens right here. This is a 50mm. It's for a Canon camera, but it is a Sigma lens. So the company Sigma has made a lens to fit on Canon camera. And the cool thing about these kind of lenses is that they have a really wide aperture. Now, obviously if you're watching this, you might not know a lot about aperture and shutter speed and all that type of stuff. So basically what I'm referring to is these have a large aperture that will allow you to get a short depth of field. Now, if you've ever seen a picture where, maybe it's a portrait or a picture of a bug or something like that and it has a completely blurred out background, that is called a short depth of field. Now, these kind of lenses are going to help you achieve that effect with large apertures. So this one right here, the aperture is a 1.4. So 1.4 is really big versus something like a 3.5, which is a little bit smaller, and that smaller aperture won't achieve a blurred background as much as this lens might. Now, every lens can achieve this effect. You can even get it with, just a standard kit lens, but these type of lenses also have another benefit in that because the aperture is wider, it is letting more light in, which will help you in low light situations. So, if you're out in the city or even if you're just out at night taking photos, these are the kind of lenses you want to have. Now, the great thing about these kind of lenses is that they tend to be very inexpensive. And I'll kind of go over the three lenses for Sony, Nikon, and Canon that you might want to pick up along with your very first camera. So all of these lenses that I'm going to be talking about are all 50mm, and their aperture is 1.8, which is still incredibly big and will work for having a short depth of field, the blurry background, and will also be great for low light situations too. Now, Sony, Canon, Nikon, almost every lens manufacturer makes these type of lenses, and they also tend to be very inexpensive. So the first one I'll start off with is Sony. Now, Sony has a 50mm 1.8, and it goes for $300. Now, like I said, that's not the cheapest lens in the world. However, it's a fantastic lens. And maybe you can find one that's used or refurbished or something like that. Maybe you can find one on Craigslist. Nikon, on the other hand, has a 50mm 1.8 for $130. Now, the drawback to this lens is it doesn't have autofocus. So you actually have to go and focus the lens manually to get what you want sharp. And Canon has their lens, which is a 50mm 1.8, and goes for only $125, and it also has autofocus with a camera like this. So you can just press the button, it'll focus, and you'll be having a good time shooting. So all of these lenses are going to be incredibly sharp. They're going to give you great detail. They'll be good in almost every situation, and I think it'll really kind of spark your love of photography because you'll be getting the kind of pictures that you kind of have in your mind when you think of photography. So I tried to make this video kind of like all encapsulating on trying to pick your first camera. And of course, I probably missed something, but I think that the key thing here is finding one that fits your budget, or even just finding one that's cheap and will just work, because that's really the key thing, just getting a camera that will work to help you start off on your journey of learning and loving photography. So if I did miss something or you have any questions, let me know down below. I always keep tabs on this channel, so if you ask a question, I'll probably get back to you in a few hours and answer your question. And also, if you have any additional questions for future videos, I can also make a new video based on your question. So if you haven't already, like the video and subscribe, because I come out with new content every week. And I'm also going out of town in like 2 days, going on a little photo trip, so maybe I'll have some kind of like on location videos that you guys can enjoy. So once again, thank you guys for watching this entire video, and I will see you on the next one.